Hi there and welcome back. It's been a little while since I've recorded one of these. I know that you just had your last lesson last week, but the last one of these that I recorded was a year ago from where we are today. So I'm excited to get back into the swing of things and continue on with some of these lessons about music history. Now, in the last podcast, you finished up Baroque vocal music by looking at the Japanese musical drama as a bit of a venture away from Europe. Now we're coming back to Europe, and the period that we're about to embark on is called the classical period. A lot of the composers that are really going to be names you recognize are going to start showing up very soon. But there's something that happened in the second half of the 18th century that allowed us to transition from the Baroque period into the classical period in Europe. And that's something that we refer to as the Enlightenment. And so we're going to pick up today and talk about music and the Enlightenment. So in the second part of the 18th century, a new musical style emerged in Europe. Called the classical style, it had important pioneers in Italy and northern Germany. One of them was Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. He was a son of Johann Sebastian Bach. But the classical style was developed particularly by several great composers active in Vienna, capital of Austria. Here, conditions seem to have been ideal for music. Geographically, Austria stands at the crossroads of four other musical nations: Germany, Bohemia, what we now know today as the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Italy. And Vienna was also central in political terms. As the capital of the powerful Habsburg Empire, Vienna was plunged in every European conflict of the time and exposed to every new cultural and intellectual current. Vienna's golden years were from 1780 to 1790, during the reign of Emperor Joseph II, the most enlightened of the long line of Habsburg monarchs. Joseph emancipated the peasantry, furthered education, and reduced the power of the clergy. He supported music and literature with his patronage and encouraged a free press. In a city of 150,000 people, there were 300 newspapers and journals during Joseph's reign, representing every shade of opinion. In this liberal atmosphere, Franz Joseph Haydn of nearby Eisenstadt became recognized as the principal composer of Europe. His symphonies were commissioned from far-off Paris and London. The young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was drawn to the capital in 1781 from Salzburg, 100 miles to the west, to spend his brilliant last decade there. And in 1792, a young musician from the other end of Germany, who had composed a long cantata mourning Emperor Joseph's death, decided to come to the great musical center to launch his career. His name? Ludwig van Beethoven. To describe Joseph II as an enlightened ruler is both to commend him and also to locate him in European intellectual history. Like a number of other rulers of the time, Joseph II derived his principles of governance from an important intellectual movement of the 18th century known as the Enlightenment, a movement that also helped to define the music that flourished under his reign. Centered in France, the Enlightenment had strong roots in English philosophy and strong offshoots in Germany and Austria. Its original source was the faith in reason that led to the great scientific discoveries of the Baroque period. Now, however, the emphasis veered away from the purely intellectual and scientific towards the social sphere. People were less intent on controlling natural forces by science and on turning these forces to universal benefit. People also began to apply the same intelligence that solves scientific problems to problems of public morality, education, and politics. Social injustice came under especially strong fire in the 18th century. So did established religion. For the first time in European history, religion ceased to be an overriding force in many people's minds. There were currents of agnosticism and even outright atheism, to the outrage of the English poet and mystic William Blake, who wrote, mock on, Voltaire, Rousseau, mock on, 'tis all in vain. You throw the sand against the wind, and the wind blows it back again. The two French philosophers named by Blake are always mentioned in connection with the Enlightenment. François-Marie Arouet, whose pen name was Voltaire, tireless satirist and campaigner for justice and reason, and the younger, more radical, more distinguished JeanJacques Rousseau. Rousseau is one of the few major figures in European philosophy who had a direct effect on the history of music, as we'll see. The Enlightenment was also the occasion for the first great contribution to Western civilization from America. In colonial days, the austere Puritan spirit was hardly in step with the growing secularization of European society, but the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers proved to be the finest flowers of Enlightenment idealism. The notion that a new state could be founded on rational principles, set down on a piece of paper, and agreed to by men of goodwill and intelligence, this could only have emerged under an influence of the political and philosophical writings of the 18th century. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The last of these three famous rights, too, was very much of its time. One might imagine the medieval barons who forced King John to accept the Magna Carta insisting on life and liberty of a sort, but it would never have occurred to them to demand happiness as a self-evident right for all. Voltaire and Rousseau fought passionately for social justice so that people might live good lives according to their own convictions. The 18th century was an age of good living, then an age that valued intelligence, wit, and sensitivity. The age cultivated elegant conversations, the social arts, and hedonism. One of its inventions was the salon, half party, half seminar, a regular gathering in a fashionable ladies' home where notables would discuss books, music, art, and ideas. Another innovation of the time was the coffee house. Another was the public concert. Entertainment, for most people, contributes to the good life, though certainly Thomas Jefferson was thinking of more than entertainment when he wrote of the pursuit of happiness. However, the pursuit of entertainment was not something that the 18th century looked down upon at all. The arts were expected to please rather to instruct, impress, or even express, as had been the case in the Baroque era. The result of this attitude is evident in the style of all the arts in the 18th century. For a time in the mid-century, a light and often frothy style known as Rococo was fashionable in painting, decoration, furniture, and jewelry design, and so on. This ceramic plaque catches the spirit of the entertainment art with special charm. Wreathed in leaves that fit in with the border, two well-dressed court gentlemen cavort in an ideal countryside. One plays the flute while the other dances. The subject, the feathery designs of the frame, even the pretty rim itself, are all characteristic of the light art of Rococo. Music in mid-century, just before the formation of the Viennese classical style, was also very light, charming at best, but often frivolous and empty. A genre that was typical of the time was the divertimento, a piece designed to divert, amuse, and entertain. Elegant figurines of musicians and ornamented music boxes playing little tunes were extremely popular. The Viennese classical music of Haydn and Mozart is far from this, yet these composers never put pen to paper without every expectation that their audiences were going to be pleased. Every historical era, of course, has had its entertainment music, but only in the classical era was great music of the highest quality put forth quite frankly and plainly as entertainment. JeanJacques Rousseau is remembered today as Europe's first alienated intellectual. Whatever his subject, he always came around to blasting the social institutions of his day as stifling to the individual. Passionately devoted to nature and to personal feeling, he disseminated the very influential ideal of natural man, who is born good but corrupted by civilization. This interest, incidentally, caused Rousseau to think hard and sympathetically about the so-called primitive people of the Americas, people whom Europeans had colonized for over 200 years without paying them serious attention. To the great French Encyclopédie of 1751 to 65, which was the Bible of Enlightenment thought, Rousseau contributed the articles on two subjects, politics and music. For Rousseau was also a self-taught composer who made his living for years as a professional music copyist. Both by means of his fiery writings and by actual example, Rousseau launched a devastating attack on the aristocratic opera of the late Baroque era. And to attack opera, the most important, extended, and glamorous musical genre of the time, was to throw Baroque music itself into question. For Rousseau, the complicated plots of Baroque operas were impossibly artificial as their complicated music. He demanded a kind of opera that would portray real people in actual life. What he and his contemporaries meant by this was simple people, close to nature, singing natural music. Thus, Rousseau acclaimed a famous Italian comic opera of the time, which played in Paris, Giovanni Battista Pergolese's La Serva Padrona, which translates to The Maid as Mistress. The music is lively and catchy, with no elaborate coloratura singing, rich harmonies, or exaggerated emotional outpourings. And the story could scarcely be more down-to-earth or rudimentary. A servant girl uses a simple ruse to trick a rich old bachelor into marriage. Thanks to Pergolesi and Rousseau, and Mozart, comic opera became the most progressive operatic form of the latter part of the century. It dealt not with Roman emperors and their idealized noble sentiments, but with contemporary middle and lower class figures expressing everyday feeling in a relatively vivid and natural way. Opera buffa, an Italian comic opera was called, will be discussed later on. In its ideals, this new kind of opera was comparable to the most important new literary genre that grew up at the same time. This was the novel, which, together with the symphony, counts as the Enlightenment's greatest artistic legacy of the 19th and 20th centuries. Precursors of the novel go back to ancient Rome, but the genre did not really capture the European imagination until around 1750. Among the best-known early novels are Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, the tale of a rather ordinary young man and his adventures in town and country, and Samuel Richardson's Pamela, a domestic drama that manages to be sexually explicit, sentimental, and moralistic all at the same time. Just before the end of the century, Jane Austen began her subtle exploration of the social forces at work on the hearts of her very sensitive and sensible characters in novels such as Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Persuasion, and others. Sharp, sympathetic observation of contemporary life and sensitive depictions of feelings, these are the ideas shared by late 18th century opera and novel. It is no accident that within a few years of their publication, both Tom Jones and Pamela were turned into major operas, one French and the other Italian. In Mozart, opera buffa found a master comparable to Jane Austen in the sensitive response to feeling and action. In his opera Don Giovanni, for example, the three women romantically involved with the hero, the coquettish county girl Zerlina, the steely aristocrat Donna Anna, and the sentimental Donna Elvira, are depicted in music with the greatest human sympathy and psychological acumen. One can come to feel that the same qualities are reflected in Mozart's symphonies and concertos. It is from the standpoint of the natural, that great rallying cry for the Enlightenment, that we should understand Neoclassicism, an important movement in the visual arts at this time. The Greek and Roman classics have meant many things to many eras. To the 18th century, they meant a return to simple, natural values. They meant a rejection of the complex solemnities of the Baroque on the one hand, and of the pleasant frivolities of the Rococo on the other. The designs of the Wedgwood pottery, the impressive portrait busts by Jean-Antoine Houdin, and the scenes from ancient history painted by Jean-Louis David are examples of 18th century neoclassical art. Christoph Willibald von Gluck, an important composer active in both Vienna and Paris, used austere classical subjects in a determined effort to reform, that is, simplify and ennoble 18th century opera. His Orfeo et Eurydice is based on the Greek myth of Orpheus, Alceste on a classical Greek drama. When Alceste reached Paris, it was greeted enthusiastically by the aging Rousseau. Apart from the operas of Gluck, however, neoclassical art has no direct connection with music in what is traditionally called the classical style. One can perhaps see that a taste inclined towards moderation, simplicity, and balance would also appreciate the order and clarity of late 18th century music, but the traditional label is not a very happy one. Classicism was a label coined in the 19th century to distinguish the music of Haydn and Mozart from the Romanticism that was then actively developed. A far-reaching development in the sociology and economics of music was the rise of public concerts. Occasional concerts had been put on before in taverns, private homes, palaces, and theaters, but it was only in the middle of the 18th century that they became a significant force in musical life. Concert series, financed by subscription, were put on by the forerunners of today's promoters. Concerts for the benefit of charity were set up on a regular basis as major society events. In 1748, Europe's first hall designed specifically for concerts was built in College Town, Oxford. Still in use, the Holywell Music Room holds about 150 people. Music of all kinds was presented at these new public concerts. One major series, the Parisian Concerts Spirituels, founded in 1725, originally concentrated on sacred vocal music, but orchestral music was the staple. The importance of concerts lay mainly in the impetus they gave to the composition of orchestral music, symphonies, and concertos. For there were, after all, other public forums for church music and opera. Now purely orchestral music, too, moved into the public domain, and its importance and prestige grew rapidly. However, the livelihood of musicians still depended principally on court patronage, the opera house, and the church. Concerts were certainly a factor in the careers of both of the masters of the classical style already mentioned. Haydn wrote his last symphonies, the London Symphonies, for concerts on 2 celebratory tours to that city, and Mozart wrote most of his piano concertos, among his greatest works, for yearly benefit concerts he put on in Vienna. But concerts were a resource that Haydn did not draw upon significantly until the end of his long life, and they were not an adequate resource, alas, to sustain Mozart. So we'll finish talking about the Enlightenment next week, starting in by talking about the features of the style of classical music, where we'll talk about tone, color, melodies, and texture. And we'll also touch on form in classical music as well, before we do a bit of a deeper dive in on the symphony. So we'll see you back here next week. Until then, cheers.